Imagine being invited into someone's home only to realize too late that it will be the last place you'll ever see. In today's video, we're going to dive into 3 killers who lured their victims into their homes where they would face unspeakable horrors. We will look at how their twisted tactics played into their crimes and ultimately their legacies as some of the most notorious murderers in history. While researching this case, the thing that stuck out most to me were that their tactics were fascinating and horrifying at the same time. And you will see why I say that. So make sure to stick around to the end of this video to not miss the true horrors of these cases and the full context of the events that actually went down. So to make this a little bit more fun, I want to try something with you. I want you to think of the answer to the following riddle that I handpicked for today's challenge. And if you're the first person to write the correct answer into the comment section, I will pin you. You have time to solve the riddle till the end of this video. The answer will be revealed in the next video, so make sure that you hit the subscribe button to not miss out on potentially winning. And of course, to not miss out on future videos from me. Also, I just want to say, please don't Google the questions. Make sure you actually take the time to think about them. So with that being said, guys, let's get into our first story. What if the quiet man next door, the man who barely looks up at you when you pass him in the hallway, invites you over? So let's say you say yes, and once you're inside of their home, the door locks behind you and you realize there's no way out. Could you trust him, or are you already in too deep? From the outside, Jeffrey Dahmer seemed like a quiet guy who just minds his own business. He lived in a simple apartment on the 25th Street block of Milwaukee, went to work, and he mainly kept to himself. Neighbors rarely took notice of him. He was just another face in the crowd. To some, he might even have seemed lonely. But even to those who exchanged the occasional nod or a wave had no idea what laid within his apartment walls. Dahmer's job at the local chocolate factory paid just enough to cover his basic needs. His demeanor seemed unassuming, disconnected even. He wasn't the kind of person who you'd invite over for dinner, but he wasn't someone who raised suspicion either. To most of his neighbors, Dahmer was simply invisible. But there was a subtle sign, small details that, in hindsight, painted a far darker picture. Some neighbors complained about foul smells emanating from Dahmer's apartment, which he dismissed as either spoiled meat or just a faulty refrigerator. You know, happens. At times, a faint sound of a power drill would be heard, but who would think twice about it in this kind of place? There was nothing remarkable about Jeffrey. He didn't stand out in the crowd, and his quiet demeanor kept him just out of reach of suspicion. The most neighbors would get out of him was a nod while passing by in the hallway or seeing him take out the trash, but most people living in his floor barely even remembered his face. To those few who would speak to him, he seemed awkward, a bit withdrawn but harmless. He usually worked long hours at the chocolate factory and came home to a quiet, solitary life. One neighbor would later recall, Jeff was a nice guy. He kept to himself, never caused any trouble. If anything, I thought he was lonely. No one suspected that behind his apartment door, Dahmer was hiding the bodies of victims, young men who had been lured by his calm, gentle promises. People said there was something almost tragic about him, a man who seemed like he just couldn't connect to anyone. But no one knew how dangerous his isolation truly was. It was just another quiet evening in Milwaukee. The kind of night where nothing seemed out of the ordinary. People were coming and going, running errands at the last few shops that were open during this time, unaware that danger was lurking right around the corner. Jeffrey Dahmer stood there, watching. His eyes scanned the street, but when they landed on Konorak, something changed. What did Dahmer see in the boy? Just a 14-year-old's innocence, vulnerability? Or was it the thrill of having found his next victim? He approached Konorak outside the store, his voice calm, almost kind and laid back. A stranger offering a couple of bucks in exchange for a couple of photographs and a beer and just a good time as well. What could go wrong? For Konorak, nothing seemed immediately threatening about Dahmer, at least not at first glance. The fact that he needed the money made it even more tempting to go along with it. So he does. Konorak goes along with it. But if he would have listened closely, maybe he would have noticed something. An edge to Dahmer's voice, a hunger behind those dead, emotionless eyes, and a night that could have been prevented. Inside Dahmer's apartment, the air was thick. It was almost musty. There was the faint smell of something metallic mixed with the sourness of spoiled food. But the boy, young and trusting, had no reason to suspect he just entered a house of horrors. As he stepped inside, the room was dark, cluttered with strange objects, bleach, tools, and something even more unsettling. A large blue drum was sitting in the corner of the room. But why would Conrad suspect anything? I mean, it's just a messy apartment, right? And at this point, it feels a little too late to dip out. Dahmer offered him a drink, laced with sedatives. How the boy's world quickly started to spin. Did the room blur around him? Maybe his head felt heavy, his vision starting to fade. But by the time he realized something was wrong, it was too late. Dahmer had him. There's a question we all find ourselves asking. What would you do if you were trapped in that moment? Trapped in a nightmare where the man who seemed harmless now hovered over you. His breath warm, his eyes darkening with something terrifyingly predatory. Conrad, his body weak from the drugs, barely able to move, watched helplessly as Dahmer calmly laid on the bed next to him. The smell in the room intensified, rotting meat mixed with chemicals. He could hear the faint sound of something breathing, the creak of the bed frame. Or was it just his heart pounding in his ears? The world around him started to spin, but Dahmer wasn't finished. In one final act, Dahmer did something he had never done before. He had a basic plan of how he was going to execute this, but he was not sure if it was going to work at all. He was going to attempt to turn Conrad into a zombie. A submissive zombie. Yes, you heard that right. So he drilled a hole in Conrad's skull and injected acid directly into his brain. What must that have felt like? The excruciating pain, the confusion, the sense that your body is no longer yours, that your mind is slipping away one by one. Conrad's last moments were in a haze of pain and terror, his senses overwhelmed by the horror of what was happening to him. The smell of death hung heavy in the air. The sound of Dahmer's steady breathing, the only thing breaking the silence in this room. But the worst part, something no one would expect in this situation, hours later when Jeffrey Dahmer was going to get beers from the stores so he could continue his crazy project, Conrad briefly regains consciousness. He's stumbling onto the streets, naked, disoriented. Could he have escaped? Could his nightmares have ended right there? Tragically, even then, fate seemed to have been against Conrad. When neighbors found him and the police arrived, Dahmer's calm, calculated lies convinced him that there was nothing more than a domestic dispute, a drunk boyfriend who was going to laugh about the situation tomorrow, sending Conrad right back into his killer's arms. Later that night, Dahmer finished what he had started. As the world outside continued to carry on as if nothing happened, inside the dark little apartment, Conrad's life was cut short. Brutally. His body disposed of like the many others before him in the hands of Jeffrey Dahmer. But how could this have happened? How could no one have seen the monster lurking behind Dahmer's quiet and unassuming facade? Conrad was only 14 when he got murdered. Jeffrey Dahmer's acts clearly showed that the mask of an unassuming man can work as a facade to lure in the innocent. But he is not the only monster hiding behind a mask. Do you have someone you trust in your community? What if the person you trusted in your community, the man who performed as a clown at children's parties, was hiding something sinister behind the smile? In the quiet suburbs of Chicago, John Wayne Gacy was more than just a friendly neighbor. He was a respected businessman, a man involved in the local politics, a husband to a lovely wife, and the father of one child, and the last person you'd ever suspect of harboring a dark secret. To his neighbors and colleagues, Gacy was someone you could trust, someone who threw block parties, helped people find jobs, even dressed as a clown to bring joy to local children. He was the man next door, always smiling, always lending a helping hand. In fact, many people affectionately knew him by the other name of Pogo Pogo the Clown, and I will tell you how he got that name, but first let's talk about the large block parties he would throw, which were very well attended by his neighbors and community members. Neighbors described these gatherings as grand events even. One neighbor mentioned he was always the guy who would throw parties and invite the whole neighborhood. He loved being the center of attention and making people feel welcome. These events were often seen as the highlight of the neighborhood, with Gacy's charm making the party come to life. He even invited local politicians, further cementing his image as well-respected and socially engaged individual. Gacy was also involved in local politics himself, becoming a precinct captain for the Democratic Party in his area. He even took a photo with the First Lady Rosalind Carter in 1978, a symbol of his standing in the political community. This elevated his public image and added to the trust and respect people already had for him. Some neighbors and friends were very proud of his political involvement. One former acquaintance said, "He was always shaking hands, always trying to help people. I thought he had a big heart, that he wanted to make our neighborhood a better place. He really fooled all of us." Although he was something like a celebrity in a circle, the thing he was most known for may surprise you. Gacy's role as Pogo the Clown is one of literally the most infamous parts of his public persona. He often performed at local hospitals, charity events, bringing joy to children while masking his true nature. One friend from Gacy's circle once remarked, "He seemed so gentle and kind. He would dress up as a clown and the kids loved him." No one could have imagined that the same man was capable of such horrific things. Something about Gacy's persona seemed almost contradicting, but it was hard to deny that Gacy's charm was rather infectious, literally infecting people. Whether he was entertaining children with his magic tricks as Pogo or shaking hands with the local politicians, Gacy managed to always be in the spotlight. He was a man who prided himself on helping others, organizing events, hiring young men in the need of work, even receiving awards for his community service. No one could have imagined that behind the painted smile and friendly facade, something far more sinister was at play for many, many years. For John Wayne Gacy, his life was a balancing act, a double life carefully constructed to hide what was laying beneath the surface. To his community, he was a model citizen, but to those who came too close, he was a monster. How could a man who was so loved and trusted be capable of such darkness? Gacy preyed on the young, vulnerable men and many teenage boys in the desperate need of work. He would offer them jobs through his construction company, PDM contractors luring them into his home under the guise of employment. His employees thought of him as the cool boss. He would invite his teenage employees over to his basement. He would host parties with no other adult present except himself, offering young adult men or teenage boys alcohol and other kinds of drugs. This would go unnoticed for the longest time, as the teenagers viewed Gacy as an authority figure, and when he says this needs to stay between us, it's going to stay between them. No word has ever left the mouth of any of these boys about the secret and illegal parties that Gacy was hosting. A member of the community says he always had young guys coming and going. He said he was helping them and giving them jobs. You'd never think anything of it. Looking back, it's terrifying. Once inside his basement, the nightmares would begin. Gacy and his special magic tricks. After inviting his victims into his home, the atmosphere might have seemed unthreatening at first. A faint hum of music from the radio, a dim overhead light casting shadows across the cluttered basement. Gacy, with his infamous charm, would laugh and joke, playing the role of the excited host. But beneath the surface, something was wrong. The air was thick, stale, carrying an odd mixture of cigarette smoke and something far worse, an acrid, almost sweet smell that clung to the damp concrete walls. It was the smell of decay. Something rotten was laying beneath the surface. "Hey, do you wanna see a magic trick?" Gacy would say with a grin, reaching for a pair of handcuffs as if it was a casual party joke. He'd tell his victims it was a magic trick, Just some fun between friends. His voice stayed light, even playful, but there was something off about the way his eyes narrowed as he clicked the cuffs into place. At first, his victims may have thought it was the part of an act, laughing nervously as they realized their hands were bound tightly behind their backs, the sound of the cuffs clicking shut almost echoing in the small enclosed space. Then Gacy's smile would fade. His eyes, once friendly, turned cold, like the light had been switched off inside of him. "Go ahead, try to escape." His voice suddenly flat and emotionless, but there was no escape. The cuffs were locked in tight. The basement, once filled with light conversation, would become eerily silent, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards above and the unsettling hum of the fridge in the corner. That's when Gacy's game would take a darker turn. His victims, helpless and terrified, would see the neatly coiled ropes nearby, maybe even catch a glimpse of the strange stains in the floor, or even worse, smelling something faintly sour and metallic. It's blood. Gacy would reach for the rope with a sense of purpose, his movements slow and confident and deliberate, but the game wasn't over yet, it just begun. He'd loop the rope around their necks in a method called the rope trick, tightening it until their breath came short, panicked gasps, their vision would blur as the noose bit into their skin. The edges of the room darkening, but just when they were about to lose consciousness, Gacy would stop, loosening the rope enough just to let them breathe, to let them feel the terror of coming so close to death and being pulled right back, only to face it again and again. The sound of their desperate breaths would fill the room, the rasp of the rope tightening and loosening, a cruel reminder of the power Gacy held over them. Gacy reveled in the control he had over them. He was feeding off of the fear in their eyes. He wasn't just tying them up. He was breaking them, forcing them to perform sexual acts, using the rope to inflict pain and strip away every ounce of hope they had left. One survivor later recalled that the way Gacy's personality would shift in an instant, from a friendly and smiling man to a monster without a warning. It was as if the man who had invited them into his home, who had laughed with them, who had joked with them, moments before this had vanished completely. He left behind only a predator. One of the victims says, "It was like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. He put chloroform over my mouth and nose. I blacked out. When I woke up, I was in incredible pain. He had violated me in every way imaginable. He just laughed as I lay there, helpless." The air was thick with tension, the room heavy with the smell of sweat and fear, but Gacy, he stayed calm, enjoying the slow and torturous death of each of his victims, their lives slipping away inch by inch as the rope tightened one last time. He stripped them from their humanity, he stripped them from their dignity, and he left them utterly defenseless. Once Gacy had tortured the victims to the brink of death, he would commit his final atrocities. Some of the young men, barely conscious, would be subjected to unspeakable abuse. Their bodies broken, their minds shattered, he would dispose of them like trash, burying their bodies in the crawl space beneath his house, where they would rot in silence, stacked one on top of the other and remain to be forgotten. Investigators later described the horrific scene when the bodies were discovered. Bones were scattered everywhere, tangled in sickening and mummified masses. It was here in this house of horrors that Gacy's crimes went undetected for years. Each time a young man disappeared, Gacy's facade of normalcy allowed him to continue his twisted games without any suspicion. Gacy has brutally violated all of his victims. He raped them and assaulted them in an unspeakable manner, and he has no remorse to this day. John Wayne Gacy's story served as a thrilling reminder that evil can often hide in plain sight. But even John Wayne Gacy was not the only one who loved to torture his victims. What if the man offering you a safe place to stay turned out to be your worst nightmare. How would you escape once the doors already shut? It was a cold, quiet night in London. The streets were empty as Dennis Nilsen walked home with yet another young man he had charmed into his company. The man, unsuspecting and looking for a place to crash for the night, followed Nilsen through the dimly lit streets of Muswell Hill, unaware that this would be the last time he'd ever leave a pub alive. Nilsen's apartment was modest, nothing out of the ordinary. There was something unsettling about it though, a heaviness in the air, as if the very walls had absorbed the darkness that unfolded within them. Could the man have sensed something? A strange smell, the stillness of the room, the eerie calm demeanor of Nilsen. As they entered the flat, the atmosphere was thick with silence, broken only by the faint dripping of water from the bathroom fosse. The victim likely sat on the couch, wary but unafraid, as Nilsen offered him a drink, and that drink would lead to a quick, hazy loss of consciousness. But the true horror was just beginning. Once the man was unconscious, Nilsen dragged his limp body to the bathroom, where the horror took a new form. The bathwater was already running. He was preparing it, filling the tub with a slow, steady stream. What must have gone on in Nilsen's mind as he lowered the man's head beneath the water, holding him there with a calm and steady force? The room with its musty, damp smell must have been suffocating, the silence broken only by the faint gurgle of the water and the shallow gasps of his helpless victim. How long did it take? How long did Nilsen watch as the life drained from his victim's body, the water now splashing over the tub's edge as the struggle grew weaker, and then it stopped altogether? There, in the dim light of the bathroom, Nilsen sat for a moment in silence, watching his victim's lifeless form. The water, now still, reflected the shadow of a man who had just stolen another life. Did Nilsen feel anything as he stared down at his victim? Or was it the emptiness that drove him to kill again and again? When it was over, the room fell silent once more, the only steady sound from the drip of the fosse echoing the silence. But for Nilsen, the night wasn't over yet. He took his time with the body, keeping it for days. He was washing it, arranging and rearranging it, almost as if death, his victim, had become something more, like an object of twisted fascination. And this wasn't the first time. Nilsen would go on to kill again, each time luring his victims into the quiet, suffocating darkness of his flat, where the line between life and death blurred under the weight of his perverse obsession. The lesson we can learn from these stories is: don't ever go home with strangers, no matter how kind their facade may seem. And I will leave you with that. I'll see you this Thursday with a psychological analysis of these 3 killers that we talked about today, and a little bit more about the background of them. So if you wondered why they did this in the first place, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the explanation to why they killed. I'll see you on Thursday.